Thank you, Veronica. It's always great to be here in cyberspace with all of you. Good evening, my dear friends and fellows and new audience. We always are eager to find new audiences for what myself and my husband were doing with such a passion, meaning traveling with a higher purpose, writing and publishing and lecturing about the stories and we collected and people we met. And Singapore is a brand new quote unquote product. It's our last trip in the prehistoric, pre-pandemic times at the end of the 2019 year. So to talk about Singapore, I will ask you to close your eyes and nobody will see you. Nobody will think you fall asleep already. And think, what image do you have in front of you when you close your eyes? And we talk about Singapore. And oh yes, thank you. The Crazy Rich Asians movie that implanted this image into the minds of millions of people. For me, however, it was different. It were my literary greats, great writers, playwrights, and my, sometimes I say, overcrowded pantheon. Some of them traveled to Singapore and wrote about it. Take, for example, Joseph Conrad. He spent 16 years from 1878 through 1994 as a seaman in the Far East, with Singapore as his most frequent port of call. And one of his most renowned novels, Lord Jim, partially takes place in Singapore. Another young man, just 24, nobody knew about him yet, left his beloved Calcutta and sailed to Burma and to Singapore on his way to the United States. It was Rudyard Kipling taking the trip that will change his life. He fell in love with the waterfront of Singapore and vividly described it. Then it was Hermann Hesse, famous German Swiss writer and author of the novels like Siddhartha and Steppenwolf and Journey to the East. He also loved the bustle, never stopping even for a minute this port of Singapore. But it was Somerset Maugham who described Singapore in the terms that really became an inspiration for myself and Alex when we began researching about this unique place and its history. And I will read it to you. Singapore is the meeting place of 100 peoples and men of all colors, black Tamils, and that's Indians from the south of India, yellow Chinese, brown Malays, Armenians, Jews, and Bengalis. The Malays, though natives of the soil, dwell uneasily in the towns and are few. It is the Chinese, supple, alert, industrious who throng through the streets. The dark-skinned Tamils walk on their silent, naked feet, as though they were not sojourners in a strange land. And the English speed past in motor cars or at leisure in their rickshaws, were a nonchalant and careless air. And I thought it was a great description of what we discover in Singapore, that's nation of cultures. But for me, there was always a song, music. I grew up in the Soviet Russia, often listening to the romances or romantic ballads of Alexander Vertinsky, who wrote a song about Singapore, this strange, mystic and mysterious place where the air was filled of banana and lemon. Can you hear me? Hope you can. So it was this place as if from the dream. And only much later I found out that this immigrant who fled the Bolsheviks after the revolution of 1917, he never was in Singapore. He never visited there. He was in Paris when he wrote this song and called it Magnolia Tango. Tango in Singapore, who knew? But the reality happened to be very different. Even after for a year, we were researching and reading about Singapore. The bustling, cosmopolitan, trendy, clean and orderly city prides itself on offering both residents and visitors the highest quality of life. This postmodern city, as it's often called, has no homelessness, no unemployment, no poverty, practically no street crime and corruption. What it does have is a universal, excellent medical care that it's envy of many developed countries, excellent government-supported education, and its citizens and permanent residents and visitors visitors trying to imagine living there, and its residents cannot imagine living anywhere else. One of our acquaintances told us about his relative coming to visit from Philadelphia, and grabbing a taxi at the airport, the driver looked at him and said, "Where are you from?" So the guy said, "I'm from United States." After the minute of silence, driver said, "How does it feel to live in the third world country?" I thought it was quite funny. Singapore plays an important part on the world stage, financial and political issues that really disproportionate to its size. It's a country of immigrants, and Singapore is often called the nation of cultures. Ethnically and religiously diverse, this city, and I don't want you to think of it as a melting pot model like United States or Australia, New Zealand, or Canada for that matter. So this city is a unique microcosm of tolerance, respect, understanding, and inclusivity. City where all ethnic groups like Chinese, Malays, Indians, Persians, Armenians, Jews, Europeans, Middle Easterners, they all live prosperous and peaceful lives, finding their rightful place in this unique city. So we often were asked, is Singapore and China, is it still British? So I wanted you to show on the map that Singapore is a sovereign island city-state in Southeast Asia. It's very small, and it's situated at the end of the Malayan Peninsula between Malaysia and Indonesia. And you can look at the map, you see that it's separated from Indonesia by Singapore Strait and separated from Malaysia by the Straits of Johor. And Singapore itself is, yes, small. It's just 31 miles from east to west, 27 from north to south, which brings us to about 277 square miles. Singapore has about 120 miles of coastline. There are approximately 5.8 million people live there, and close to 5 million are residents and citizens. Ethnic-wise, the largest ethnic group are Chinese, 76.4%. Then they follows by Malays and 13% and about 9% are Indians. Less than 1,000 families identify themselves as Jewish. And Jewish story of Singapore manifests a fascinating narrative that just like Singapore itself and its ethnic mosaic, Jewish story consists of the narrative not just about one community, but again, mosaic of quite several. And just like a small Singapore play an important role on world stage, Jews, this tiniest of the tiniest minorities, played and are playing highly important role in Singapore's past and its present. And after meeting people and talking to them, I compiled few quotes that I wanted you to see, to understand, sorry, how Jews of Singapore think about themselves and their life in this country. The real Jewish Singapore royalty, fourth generation Singapore-born Baghdadi Jew, said the Jews here have never been numerous, but their cultural heritage continues to be inseparable part of the Singapore mosaic. A woman, a German Jew of Persian ancestry who was born and educated in Germany, then lived and worked in the US. And for the last 30 years, she's been living in Singapore, raising her children. I do not think, she said, I could now return to a life in a country with one culture, be it in the US or Germany. Singapore is my true home. Young Israeli man who came to Singapore for 2 or 3 years, but now has been living there for 10 years, married to Chinese woman. He said, my Jewish identity, he's an Israeli, my Jewish identity was developed here in Singapore. A Chinese woman married to an Israeli, raising her children Jewish. She said, it's never either or here. In Singapore, it's such an inclusive culture, different ethnicities, different religions. They blend together, but remain intact. She is not a writer, but I think the way she expresses it is just perfect for Singapore mosaic. Blend together, but remain intact. It's very easy, she said, to be Chinese and Jewish and Singaporean at the same time. So what made Singaporeans Singaporeans? How was it possible to create this mosaic that of cultures, traditions, ethnicity, races blending together, but remaining intact? And to understand that, I will invite you to join with me through Singaporean history, 202 years, no less. Meet its people, meets its ethnic groups, see its arts and architecture, and then approach Jewish narrative from that knowledge you will gain within an hour, from that perspective, and understand the Jewish story of Singapore. So here you see a wonderful, charming creature that has a fish body and lion's head, and his name is Merlion. Mermaid and lion all together, and it's a national symbol of this country. The fish body is supposed to remind you about humble beginnings of Singapore as a fishing village nobody knew about. The fact that it's been a bustling, successful port from the beginning of the 14th century does not matter. For the British narrative of myth of origin, it didn't matter. So, okay, it's fish body and its humble beginnings. The head of the lion reminds us about the real name, ancient name for Singapore, which is Singapura, or Lion City in Malay, because one of the czars of this Malay region went to hunt, and he met a terrible, mighty animal that he scared away. And he thought it was a lion. And now we have this Merlion all over Singapore, charming everybody who knows it. On the right of this slide, you will see the monument to the founder, Sir Stamford Raffles. He was a British statesman. He was lieutenant governor of the Dutch East India Company. And when he arrived to what is Singapore now in 1819, he understood that this geographic location in the center of the South Indian Sea would be extremely beneficial for the British Empire developing its trade routes. So he was authorized to talk to the Malay Sultan, offer him forgiveness of his astronomical debts to the crown, and get the right to build Singapore. At the same time, the British left Indonesia, which was ruled by the Dutch, and in response, the Dutch acknowledged British rights for the Singapore. And there is a beautiful hotel, Raffles Hotel in Singapore and elsewhere, even in Paris and London. It's a royalty of hotel industry named after the city founder. In this hotel, famous cocktail called Singapore Sling was invented. It's really just a gin and cherry brandy, but now they add all kinds of sweet juices to this, and I think it's not good for cocktail or our sugar level. One of the best ways to explore Singapore is on water. And we took this bumboat river cruise. And bumboats are historical vessels that used to carry provisions for sale to ships in port. The bridges over the Singapore River, it's a dream come true for engineer, photographer Alex. Collection of bridges is incredible. It's Kavanagh Bridge is the only suspension bridge and one of the oldest bridges in Singapore. Fullerton Hotel, 1919, the British built it to celebrate their centennial, 100 years of Singapore. And this beautiful hotel recently refurbished. Its interior, it's like Art Deco style museum. Hotel is inseparable from the Singapore history. When in August 1965, Singapore celebrated its independence from the British. This is where it was celebrated in the hotel and near the Kavanagh Bridge. Another beautiful bridge, the Elgin Bridge. Remember Elgin marbles from Parthenon in the British Museum, and that's Elgin. He was Lieutenant Governor of India at that time. Singapore loves its history and very carefully, very lovingly and scientifically preserves every colonial building. And this is Boat Quay. That's where Lord Jim's, some of its action was taking place. Used to be very busy trading center, and now it's a location for famous bars and restaurants. And now again, this wonderful animal charming everybody who is around him. Now we're in the colonial center, the Padang, the square. What you see is a national gallery, which is called the latest addition to the art crown of Singapore. Typical Singapore fashion. They combined two iconic British colonial buildings. What you see here is the former Supreme Court, and here is former City Hall. So Supreme Court and City Hall, and now it's a national gallery. It's one of the greatest Asian collections and has over 8,000 pieces. Singapore Cricket Club, very exclusive, was open only to the British, and now it's open only to members who pay quite a few thousand of Singaporean dollars a year and have to be recommended by key members of the board. Well, didn't I tell you that I'm not done with Singapore Sling cocktail? It was significantly improved here because you see the British aristocrats, all these gentlemen ruling the colony, loved their cricket games. And after the games, they used to sneak to the nearby Chinatown to meet with beautiful Chinese gals. So their wives decided to cut this habit now and then. They began congregating in the restaurant and the club, drinking this cocktail, to which they added many sweet juices and syrups, but many marriages were preserved. And it still functions, as I told you, as a cricket club. You cannot miss this imposing tower and spire of St. Andrew's Cathedral. And this is Singapore's largest cathedral, the oldest Anglican house of worship. And it used to be and still is the most prestigious school for young boys. And key families, whether they're Chinese or Muslim or Indians or Jewish, were sending their boys there, not for religious education, but for general one before the boys would be sent to England to continue their education. If it's an Anglican house of worship, then why it's named after the patron saint of the Scots? Well, it were Scottish merchants who wrote the check, and if you write the check, you know the story. And since we're the subject of colonial churches, I want to show you two other churches that got new life according to very Singaporean tradition. One on the left, the Church of the Holy Infant Jesus chimes. You know, if you look at abbreviation, M does not belong there. It's just there because it sounds good. Was founded by French Jesuit priests 1854, run by the Knights of the convent, at school, and the orphanage for abandoned babies. Well, after a while, there were no abandoned babies. The nuns had nothing to do, and convent stayed empty until in 1993, it was redeveloped and got new life, reborn as, you know what, elegant complex of shops, restaurants, and art galleries. And on the right, the oldest church, Armenian Apostolic Church, that was built in 1830s. And since Armenian community is very small, and after a while, church went into disrepair, now after being redeveloped, refurbished, it's still church for the Armenian community, but it's also in a typical Singaporean tradition. And it's opened the door to other denominations. Coptic Egyptian community comes there to pray, and United Hebrew congregation, the Reformist and liberal congregations that doesn't have its own building yet. There are so many theaters and concert halls in Singapore. It's probably the only city in Asia I can imagine myself living almost normal life. Victoria Theatre and Concert Hall. Well, this building started as a memorial hall in 1905, just a few years after Great British Empress passed away. But then it was remodeled and became a theater. It seems they never could have enough theater spaces. It's a concert hall, 673 seats, a drama theater, 614 seats, and gallery, art and gallery space, one after another. On the right, it's Singapore Philharmonic. They have renowned orchestra. And here is the art house in the old Parliament building. After the new building was opened up in 1999, what to do with the old? Of course, very logical decision for the Asian city center. They turned it into the theater and music hall, and also into art house cinema, where one could see Casablanca or Citizen Kane. And that's historic parliamentary chamber of Singapore is preserved as the museum. Singapore became independent in 1965, and they function according to, they largely based on the Westminster system. Its parliament is unicameral, and it's made up of MPs who are elected and some non-elected and selected. It's a complicated system. That's, you can see in new Parliament House. And now let's look at cutting edge Singapore architecture and its arts. Here there's Singapore skyline that we loved so much. From the place where Alex took this photo, we were waiting for the beautiful sunset and the spectacular light show over the river. I know, you know, if you and I would be doing this presentation in person, I'm sure you would remind me already that Singapore used to have a bad rap for its how would I say, it's very strict, some say draconian disciplinary rules and chewing gum ban. But back in the end of October 2019, when we were there, the city was so hip, so modern and cosmopolitan and cool. It was like nonstop happening spectacle, truly a city renaissance of epic proportions. But you still cannot chew or even possess chewing gum. And we're back again to this iconic building. The author, the architect, is the architect of genius from Israel, Moshe Saidi. In this hotel, you know, these 3 towers, it's a hotel, but it's actually much more than that. It's a universe. It's an integrated resort, as they say, and it has the largest in the world casino. and shopping mall and skating rink and concert halls. And on the top in the boat, it's a sky garden and the largest in the world infinity pool. And that's hotel at night. And here it is, 500 feet long, the largest infinity pool. And it's also the only pool in the world that I know of and nobody swims. Everybody takes picture. And I don't know who these people are. They have a nerve popping up now and then in Alex's photos, especially her. Don't pay any attention to them. Gardens by the bay. It's near their Marina Bay Sands Hotel. It's unique, world-famous horticultural masterpiece. It's located along the vast area of Singapore waterfront, 250,000 rare plants, and heritage gardens that designed with great explanations in multiple languages, designed to represent plants and fruits that that's natural to the major ethnic groups, Chinese, Malays, and Indians. And of course, the crown lady is a super tree. And this 16-story high vertical trees, quote unquote, or rather vertical gardens, which is an incredible combination of science, gardening, and environment preservation. They collect rainwater, they generate solar power, act as venting ducts for the many conservatories in the garden. And that's the trees, super trees at night. It's a terrific show. And yes, it's not a typo. It's Art Sciences One Word Museum. Again, it's Moshe Safdie, the first ever museum that he believes he conceptualized as dynamic interplay between art and science. And this 10 fingers or petals, that's actually, they're all different radius and they all different lengths. They have natural lighting. They house 21 naturally lit galleries. It's incredible architecture, art by itself. Another iconic building, Esplanade, theaters on the bay, more theaters. And it does look like to cut in half durian, which is a strong smelling fruit beloved in this region. And I love the taste. You have to get used to the smell. I especially like the chocolate with durian. And this is what's called the World Building of the Year when they open up. That's residential complexes of vertical villages. And they had this title, the best world buildings, residential buildings of the year for many years, I think for years 5 or 6, and they opened 2013. And of course, Daniel Libeskind is in Singapore. His architecture always tells a story. And the most important feature of Singapore architecture is not even Marina Bay Sands Hotel that re-envision how the city skyline should look like. No, it's apartments for the public. Life in Singapore is very, very expensive. And over 80% of the resident population lives in public housing. And that's immaculate, very conveniently planned flats that located in housing estates in the self-contained satellite towns with well-maintained schools, supermarkets, hospitals, clinics, recreational facilities, of course, include multiple metro stations to connect people who live there with every corner of the city. And they pay a very modest fee depending on their income. And Singapore considered this as a vital measure to provide immaculate and safe housing surrounded by public amenities at affordable prices. It's also meant to foster social cohesion between social classes, to eradicate poverty. It's a middle-class society. And that's how Singapore reached one of the highest in the world house ownership. Over 90% people who live in public housing bought their apartments from the government. Singapore is the only city I know of in the world that has a museum dedicated to public program. They consider it part of Singaporean identity. Street murals reflect the city soul because Singaporean government realized that art should not belong only to museums and galleries. If you take it into the street, it might have transformative effect, not only beautifying the environment, but people will stop in their tracks and connect with their surroundings. And that's probably how it happened. And of course, the streets of Singapore, it's Museum of Modern Sculpture. They have Dali, they have Henry Moore. And our most beloved sculpture is in the Gardens by the Bay, and it's called The Planet. This statue of the baby weighs 7 tons and spans almost 10 meters and appears to be floating in mid-air. It's a stunning engineering feat. It's sculptor, British sculptor, said that planet is a paradox, hugely heavily, yet the bronze appears weightless. It's big, but also image of vulnerability. It's both a reflection of ourselves and the earth upon which we live. And Singapore, even the airport, is like no other airport, is a work of art. Jewel, this pavilion, also brought to Singapore by Moshe Safdie, architect. It's really redefined airport. It's retail in public space forever. Airport like no other. You can spend hours and hours just being there. And since with these beautiful houses, models of which you can see at the airport, I want to take you through the shop houses as typically Singaporean art form. It's lovingly preserved when we create our own artworks through the streets in the old center to see in this house. They all of different styles, from Art Deco to classical, and they all managed by the government as national historical landmarks. And here you can see beautiful Art Decos. And now we're coming to visiting Singapore ethnic mosaic. Singapore prides itself in the nation of cultures. It's a country of immigrants, but they like to think of themselves. Many cultures, one people. In their constitution, one of the first provisions was written, it shall be the responsibility of the government constantly to care for the interest of the racial and religious minorities in Singapore. And here we're in Chinatown. You might ask, in a country where over 76% are Chinese, why do you need Chinatown? Don't ask me, ask Senior Raffles, who while developing the city, he decided that to deal better with the flood of immigrant Chinese and Malays and Indian workers would be to build the housing for them by segregating this new residents of Singapore by their racial and religious aspects. And that's how we have Chinatown. It's very clean, very elderly, very colorful, it's beautiful. And it has what I never seen in any Chinatowns anywhere in the world, the Street of the Dead, which is literally was where poor people came to die, because most poor immigrants, Chinese immigrants, lived in overcrowded quarters, and there were not enough space for the living, live alone for the dying. So the dying people would come here, they would have care, but minimal medical care, since they were not expected to recover. The Street of the Dead was outlawed, and funeral parlors and all this care system back in 1961. And temples everywhere. This temple is a National Historical Landmark and modeled after Tang Dynasty temples. It has Buddha tooth. And now we're coming to Little India. And since we're close to metro, I wanted to mention something about Singapore transportation. They have excellent, very clean, very orderly transportation system. Metro has 130 stations and they span over 200 kilometers. Over 4 million daily people take the metro, and then they also have rail system with 2 light rapid transits that serve as a feeder service, bringing commuters closer to their homes. Well, who would need cars if you have such an excellent transportation system? It happens many do. Singapore has one of the highest car densities in the world, but you will never see traffic jams on their expressways, even in rush hours, because the government decided that they can regulate the car ownership and the traffic, how to deal with it. The car ownership cannot grow faster than the roads being built. It seems very simple and very reasonable. And of course, because the land available for roads and for expressways is at a premium, then requirements to car owners is, how to say it politely, very, very strict, considerable. There are no cars manufactured in Singapore. You have to import it. You pay importation tax 45% of the cost. Then you have to register your car. You pay 150% of the car cost. Then you have to pay the tax for building the roads, and it depends on the size of your car. And then when you buy a new car, and most people do, you have to buy certificate of enlightenment, and it's highly regulated by the government. So the most modest of cars could easily cost you 125, 130,000 Singaporean dollars, which is close to 100 US dollars. But as you see, there are many, many cars. And we are in Little India. It's a beautiful, beautiful area. And we were there when Indians all over the world, including Singapore, were getting ready for the holiday of Diwali, holiday of the good and bad, and the victory of good over evil. Very colorful. And temples. If you visited India and you have an idea of Indian temples like those traditional Hindu temples you see in Delhi or in Varanasi or Khajuraho, here are different. Because Indian population in Singapore, mostly Tamils, they came from the south of India, from Kerala and from Sri Lanka. And the architecture is here Dravidian, which is an architectural idiom in Hindu temple that emerged in the southern part of the Indian subcontinent, South India, Sri Lanka, that never ever was covered by the Muslims, by the Arabic invasion. And there was no such thing as Hindu-Persian architecture that produced Taj Mahal. So that's beautiful temple. The only temple from the north of India was built in the 1970s by people coming from Gujarat. I've seen it. We're in Muslim neighborhood now. Majority of Muslims are Malays. And Malays are considered to be the indigenous people of the region. And one of the provisions of the Constitution states that it shall be the responsibility of the government to recognize special position of the Malays, who are the indigenous people of Singapore. And they do. From cultural anthropology point of view, from historians' point of view, for me it seems that Malays' origins, they enshrined in symbolic trappings of statehood. The anthem is in Malay. The first minister of independent Singapore was a Malay. And it's, of course, there are people who are Muslims who come in from India, who come in from the Middle East, by majority are Malays. And that's the Sultan Mosque. And a lot of money were given for building this mosque initially by Sir Stamford Raffles. Every ethnic minority, every ethnic group has a museum dedicated to scientific preservation of their cultures at Malay Heritage Center. And now we're ready to come into the Jewish story. We just like the story of the Chinese or Malays or Indians or Tamils. It's a spectacular mosaic of cultures and traditions. But the story of Jewish story of Singapore belongs, first of all, to the Baghdadi. And the name is misleading. Some of the Baghdadi indeed originated from Baghdad and even trace their heritage to the Babylonian exile, which is 578 BCE. For many, though, their home could be Basra, Cairo, Karachi, or other cities in the Middle East. What differentiated greatly the Baghdadi Jews from the Ashkenazi, or those who came from Europe, or Sephardic Jews who came originally from Iberian Peninsula after the Edict of Expulsion, but for almost 500 years lived in benevolent Ottoman Empire. What differentiated Baghdadi, that when they migrated to different places in the world, they did not do it like Ashkenazis who were fleeing from pogroms and murders and persecution, or Sephardic Jews who were escaping Ottoman Empire, its anarchy when the empire was disintegrated in the beginning of the 20th century. They always were moving for economic opportunities. And the British-ruled India, with its open economic and religious environment, the Baghdadi Jews has been well established since mid-1700s. And by the 1800s, so in few short decades, they developed and ruled extensive trade works in an entire Southeast Asia. It could be legalized opium trade. It could be precious wood like teak wood or cedar wood. It could be gems. It could be tea. It did not matter. The Baghdadis were extremely successful. And the British did appreciate it greatly, but they never thought about them as equal. Baghdadi never were numerous. There could be about 3,000 of them in both Delhi and Calcutta, about 1,500 in Rangoon and Burma, less than 1,000 in Singapore, less than 1,000 in Hong Kong. It did not matter. Neither the geographic location nor the size of the community matters for their success. What did matter, that's family connections. But in a world without computers and text messages and cell phones, the Baghdadi always knew what's going on, what's happening in Calcutta, what's going on in Hong Kong or in Singapore, because they had this incredible, unique connection through the family ties. And these ties were supported by the family connections. And this foundation of this incredible partnership between the families, the foundation were the institutions, Jewish cemeteries, mikveh, the ritual bath, and of course, the synagogues. And on the left hand side of this slide, you will see the photograph of the famous Sassoon family. Sassoons were huge everywhere. David Sassoon is the only one wearing European dress. But in Singapore, there were other families who rose to greatness. The early arrivals were one of them called Father of the Faithful, Abraham Solomon, highly successful trade importer, exporter. He was born in Baghdad, but had his successful business in Calcutta. And then maybe due to the Sassoons becoming so great in Calcutta and Delhi, he decided to find another place for himself. And he came in 1936, he came to Singapore. In 1836, he came to Singapore. By the way, his younger brother, Simeon Solomon, was very successful pre-Raphaelite groups artist and member of the Royal Academy of Art. His brother was much more economically and financially minded. Abraham Solomon was instrumental in building the first synagogue in the early 1840s when it were just 40 Jewish families in Singapore. But before him came the first Jew in Singapore, Nathaniel Wallach. He was MD, surgeon, but his claim to fame was great botanist. He was the one who designed and developed Kew Gardens in London. He also was friend of Sir Raffles, who invited Nathaniel to come and turn Singapore what we now know as the Garden City. He was instrumental in creating great botanical gardens all throughout British Empire, but especially in Singapore, he became very famous. So their legacy. On the left, you can see Abraham Solomon, the first synagogue in Singapore. We don't have a picture photograph. This house does not exist, but that's where it was located on the Boat Quay. And it served Jewish community for about 37 years and inspired the name of the street as a synagogue street on the other side of the Boat Quay. But Nathaniel Wallach has his, sorry, Wallach has his street, of course, too, but he also has the most expensive residence in Singapore named after him. You know who bought this residence? It was in July 2019. Nobody invited us to take a look. So the man who bought it is one of the richest men in Great Britain, Sir James Dyson, creator of the vacuum cleaner or bagless vacuum cleaner empire, based on a couple of his patents. He bought it just for the 80 million, it were Singapore millions, so probably were like 69 US millions. So that's the legacy of Nathaniel Wallach, immortalized in the most expensive residence. Jewish leaders and philanthropists, and that's I wanted to mention that the Baghdadi Jews brought to the British Empire something that never existed in Asia, philanthropy. They built synagogues, of course, but they also built schools, not just Jewish schools, schools for the people around them. They built hospitals, Jewish hospital and hospitals for the Chinese, for Indians, for the people. They also were founders of universities and cities landmarks. And in Singapore, it's Mayor family. Sir Manasseh Mayer, he was a leader, philanthropist. He was instrumental in building both great synagogues in Singapore. And we will go to the synagogues in a minute. And you will see that for the community of 1,000 people, it's not just 2 houses of worship, it's a palaces of worship. They were built by Manasseh Mayer. He also was instrumental in founding the University of Singapore and building the science campus, which is named after him. He was knighted in 1921 by the Crown in recognition of his public service and benevolence. The second man who is known as the father of independence, it's David Marshall, another Baghdadi Jew. He was a lawyer, historian, politician, and he was instrumental in negotiations that led first to what was called home rule or partial self-governance when Singapore became part of Malaysia, but in 1965, Singapore became independent country. Well, that's creation of Sir Manasseh Mayer, the Magen Aboth Synagogue. It's elegance in simplicity. He built it in 1878. So it's one of the oldest Jewish buildings existing in Southeast Asia. It's built in kind of a Roman Greek style. Next to it is Jacob Bellas Center, who also was a philanthropist and community developer, prominent member of the Jewish community. Of course, he was a royalty in Baghdadi, like many of the first Jews. He was very successful stockbroker, became chairman of Singapore and Malaysia Stock Exchange. And this is JCC. For the community, 1,000 members, there are 2 centers that serve as JCCs, and fine kosher restaurant that very popular among Jews and non-Jews alike. It's in Ballas Center. It's also is kosher supermarket. And look at this beautiful synagogue. It's marble and carpet, and it sits about 300 men downstairs and about the same number of women I was told can sit upstairs. Well, by the early 20th century, Jewish community of Singapore had an influx of Jewish immigrants from Europe, Ashkenazi Jews, fleeing pogroms and persecution. And they come to the Magen Abbot synagogue, and the arguments start how you should pray, the Baghdadi style or Sephardic style. Ashkenazi wanted their style. So Manasseh had enough of that, and he decided he will build his own synagogue on the land belonging to his family. And he built this small buildings. It probably will sit about 500 people. At first was only for his family, and he even had to hire paid minyan to have 10 men for the services. There were not 10 men in his family at that time. This synagogue, by the way, was visited by Einstein. In 1922, Einstein came to Singapore on a fundraising mission, raising money for building the University of Jerusalem. And Manasseh Meir gave him about $300,000. That's what amount to 300,000 US dollars now. So it was a huge amount of money. This synagogue is also very beautiful. It has covered porch enough for the horse carriage to get in. Reuben Meir was son of Manasseh Meir, and that's another JCC. Well, both synagogues are Baghdadi Orthodox synagogues. But people coming there of very different cultural traditions, religious or non-religious, even those who consider themselves intensely secular, but have a need to come, put a tefillin and pray with their co-religionists. Manasseh Meir, when he died, he left a huge endowment for preservation and maintenance of these both synagogues and Jewish schools, and the education. He started a company for publishing and translating religious Hebrew books and distributing in throughout the world as well. And that's the entrance. So you can see beautiful marble columns and the real gold as decorations. And there is something else in the synagogues that was never, ever in any other synagogue. The synagogues would not have symbols or icons in the interior, but there, if you know where to look, would be Manasseh Meir's initials. He did so much for the community. In the center, as in many Sephardic or Baghdadi synagogues, you can see bima or elevated podium for the rabbi to lead the services, and behind it is the Achel, the Ark, which is the holiest place in the synagogue where Sefer Torah, so Torah scrolls, are stored. This synagogue is named Chazet El. And this is where the Achel is built on a raised platform that used to be in Baghdadi synagogues, directly opposite the entrance. And you know what? It faces westward towards Jerusalem, because they are in the east. To face Jerusalem, they have to be to face the west. And on the top, it's inscribed, "Lo, in thine abundant life I enter thy house. In reverence to thee, I bow towards thy holy temple." And this ark has 3 entrances. Each one is covered by beautiful curtain embroidered. The floor is in marble and expensive Persian carpet. And this is Torah shown to us our new friend Nisim, who is a senior assistant to the rabbi of the Chazet El synagogue. And this is the chair of Manasseh Mayor, where he used to sit and follow the rabbi. And if he saw the rabbi does not pronounce words correctly, he would be very angry. Nissim himself is from Greece, and he brought his young family when he found this job at the synagogue. And he thinks that's where he's going to live, that you could not find better place for a Jew, though it's very, very, very expensive, he told us. And we spent probably a few hours talking to Rabbi Asher, who is an Ashkenazi French rabbi leading the Baghdadi synagogue. He has MBA and PhD in psychology, but since he promised his parents that he will continue his rabbinical studies that were interrupted when he took up the PhD program, he became a rabbi, and he's been in Asia for over 20 years and few years leading the Baghdadi synagogue. There is quite a mosaic of rabbis in synagogues of Singapore. A rabbi in the center, Mordechai Abergel, he is a Sephardi from Brussels, and he's been there for over 20 years. He's very proud to serve the synagogue of indigenous Jews of Singapore, he said. He is a rabbi in Magen Abbas synagogue. You already met Rabbi Asher Fatman, an Ashkenazi friendship leader of the Shezetel synagogue. Well, community needs a third congregation, and it's led by a couple of very young rabbis from New York, New Jersey area, Miriam and Benny Weinberg. And they lead Union Hebrew congregation that they describe as a reformed, liberal, progressive, reformist, reconstructionist congregation. And they think that it's about 140 people in their congregation. Doesn't have permanent building currently, and meets either an American club or in the Armenian church. Singapore is a symbol of religious harmony, said Rabbi Abergel from Magen Abbas, and the truth is it. What's going on within every ethnic group and within Jewish community as well? And it's many communities. You have Persian Jews, you have Armenian Jews, you have Ashkenazi Jews who could be Polish or Australian or Russian, or could be Jews with no Jewish identity previously. And they all find their own place. Many of them finding Jewish identity for the first time in their life. We were told, integrate while preserving own cultural traditions. And one of the men we talked to, who is married to a Chinese woman, said that that's what they have for Shabbat. They have challah, but they like bamboo charcoal challah that his wife often serves with kaya. And kaya is a very tasty coconut egg jam. And they always have bok choy, which is, Chinese cabbage. We can have it, we can find it in our supermarkets, and kangkong of water spinach. So it's a typical Shabbat in Israeli, Chinese, American, Singaporean family. And this is building with Jewish star on it. It's not JCC, it's not Jewish club. It was a trade company of a Baghdadi Jew, David Elias Trade Company. And that's how he wanted it to be built. It was very touching aspect of what this building, finding this building, looking at it, it was what turned an Israeli man who came from very secular family in Tel Aviv. He said he never thought about belonging to a synagogue. He didn't have to prove anyone he's Jewish or to feel Jewish. Because he lived in Israel, everybody was Jewish there. When he came to Singapore to start his software design company, he did not even look for Jewish community, but suddenly he said he and his wife realized that they surrounded by Jewish street names, by Jewish monuments, by synagogues, even a Jewish Star building. And this Jewish Star building, he said, has a place in his heart. It took me coming to Singapore, he said, to really find my Jewish roots and my Jewish soul. He is a member of Union Hebrew congregation, but he also sometimes goes to Baghdadi to the Orthodox congregation when he feels like it. Singapore's symphony really reflects the city ethnic and religious mosaic. It's a photograph of a man we talked to, Jamie Hirsch, who is from Baltimore. He came for a few years on a contract and he stayed there for 24. And he said he cannot imagine better place to live as a Jew. And he thinks that he's a secular Jew, but he goes to this synagogue or to that synagogue, participate in holidays, many of his friends, Israelis. Sunday school at Chesed El also is a mosaic of cultures and ethnic backgrounds. You can look at these beautiful children. And the other photograph is Bar Mitzvah at United Hebrew Congregation. What I also wanted to let you know, something that not many know, and it's not often discussed. It's very special Israeli-Singapore relationships. In the early 1960s, even before Singapore became an independent country, they began to develop close relationship with Israel. And Israeli advisors from the military and security services came over to the country and stayed. Singapore Army is built by and closely advised to this day by the Israeli. And Singapore R&D and high tech is also done with closed partnership with Israeli companies. In 1997, the Singapore Israel Industrial R&D Foundation, SIRD, established to promote, facilitate, support joint industrial R&D project. There is an Economic Development Board of Singapore, and there is an Office of Chief Scientist of the Ministry of Industry and Trade of Israel that very closely work together to this day. There are no anti-Semitism ever in Singapore. A very close relationship with Israel, so special to this country. So what I wanted you to think about, what can we learn? What do we want to learn from Singapore? In our country, it's hard to imagine the government telling you what car to buy and when to buy it, or to can you chew chewing gum or not. But in Singapore, people accept the nanny state model of government, this big brother government, for the safety, for the lack of crime. The cleanliness, the order in this country, in this city, is almost unreal. They accept it because they want to see absence of poverty and homelessness. They want to live in a middle-class society that has no poor people. They want to have wonderful universal health care, one of the very best of the world, complete absence of prejudice, and racial, religious, ethnic, cultural tolerance and inclusion. People who live in Singapore cannot imagine living anywhere else. They embrace this many cultures, one nation model. And I'm very grateful to you all that you allowed me and Alex to relive our trip to this wonderful place. And since this event was sold out, and I received many calls from our usual follows and many emails asking me, could you do something, please? If you want, please do stay in touch with us. If you are not on our mailing list, then send me your email. My email is very simple. My first name dot my last name at gmail.com, irene.shaland@gmail.com. Alex usually sends out our newsletter twice a week about our latest publications and our upcoming events. So you will be the first to know.